Why don't we get started? So my name is Reverend Dr. Mae Elise Cannon. I am joining you from the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. I split my time between here and Washington, D.C. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace, which is one of the host organizations for this conversation. Churches for Middle East Peace is joining the network of evangelicals for the Middle East, and Rob is on their leadership team. He'll tell you about Mimi in a few minutes, and we're partnering also with Evangelicals for Justice. And so Rob and I sit on the board of Evangelicals for Justice. I would imagine that's how many of you heard about this conversation today. And we're gathered to talk about peacemaking in the midst of war, and specifically what pastoral and prophetic responses might look like in response to the war between Israel and Hamas. And so that's what we'll be discussing. We're going to start, and I'll have Rob introduce himself, and he'll talk for a few minutes, and then I'll make some introductory remarks, and then we'll have the opportunity for questions. Mm-hmm. And so you can feel free to put questions in the chat, or you have that Q&A feature underneath your screen. If you want to make sure your questions don't get lost, it's better to use the Q&A feature. Sometimes it's hard to follow in the panel, but thank you for those who've introduced yourselves thus far. We're glad you're here. May the Lord go before us in this conversation. And Rob, I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to talk further about all that's happening in Gaza and in Israel. So why don't you get us started?
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Reverend Dr. Rob Dalrmle. I am the Executive Director of Determined Truth Ministries. DeterminedTruth.com is our homepage. It's a ministry designed to challenge the church to be the church. I have 34 years of academic and pastoral experience, and I stepped out of a pastoral role about 2.5 years ago to begin this ministry. I now have a colleague, Pastor Danny Hall, who's joined me as well. And our passion was to be a voice, a prophetic voice of the church, which we felt was limited sometimes in an institution, and it's limited sometimes when you're in a church setting. You have the confines of those constituents that are in your congregation or part of your academic institution. So it gave us an opportunity to be a voice. So I write a weekly blog, I have a weekly podcast, I'm involved with a lot of leadership things with Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East and things of that nature, trying to be, just bring awareness of justice issues, of the scripture, of the kingdom of God. So just a brief word about NEME, the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. You can find that at neme.network. So neme.network. And it says that our goal really is to mobilize to a holistic perspective of engagement with Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East. Our passion with NEME was to try to find a niche where you have people kind of on the left and people kind of on the right, and they're talking past each other and never talking towards one another. We wanted to provide that niche where we could speak into that evangelical community and kind of give them a reasoned, passionate understanding of what's happening with maybe a more holistic perspective. So my passion has always been obviously Jesus and the New Testament. My PhD is in biblical interpretation. And when I come and see something of this nature, I look and first, I approach it from the fact that the church is complicit. The church is in the midst of this issue, whether we like it or not, especially the evangelical church of which I grew up in, which my heritage was in. That has this eschatological framework, eschatological understanding, meaning end times understanding, that Israel was God's chosen people, and we need to bless them at all times in order to be blessed by God, and that there were going to be certain signs happening in Israel and the Middle East and things of that nature that would precipitate the coming of Jesus. And we've been hearing sermons after sermons after sermons. I saw one made the other day that had 2.5 million hits, and I didn't even know who the pastor was. I had never heard of this pastor. But he's giving a sermon, 45 minutes, on why this is the signs of the end times. We know of Greg Laurie, the October 8th, the day after October 7th, he was preaching in his congregation that we should be looking up because Jesus is about to return, and the audience began applauding. And of course, at that point in time, you had 1,400 Israelis that had passed away, and 200 and something odd people that had been taken hostage, and you knew a bombardment of Gaza was going to take place next. So I come at it from this perspective, saying, wait a second, we are complicit in this. And yet I look at the gospel and the kingdom as a call to radical discipleship, radical Christ-loving, sacrificially loving for the sake of the nations, for the sake of the other, laying down our life for others, and a call to peacemaking. and say, whether the nations of the world are justified in war, whether the nations of the world are justified in retaliation. And you can go all kinds of ways with saying, well, whether Israel's justified in retaliating or not. My answer is the church has to step back from this. And we have to be able to critique nations and to critique empires and say, this is not the way of bringing lasting peace. And Mae as well, I've been doing a series of 10, 11 live streams on my own ministry, and you can find them all on determinedtruth.com's homepage. We have number 8 tonight at 5 p.m. Pacific time. In which I've been bringing in different voices and bringing in Mae was one of my voices. Dr. Fisk was one of my voices. Jonathan Kutab, a Palestinian lawyer. And yesterday I had Lisa Loden and Richard Harvey, who are 2 Messianic believers. Lisa lives in Israel, Netanya. And their answer is, we need to stop this war. This is not good for Israel. It's not good for the Palestinians. And so as a Christian, I want to step back, and as a biblical scholar, I want to step back and say, this is not the way of Christ's kingdom. This is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to broker peace. And then obviously, and we can discuss this in the Q&A time, but there's all kinds of narratives out there that you can't broker peace with Hamas, you can't broker peace with terrorists, and we can respond to those later. So I simply want to point out that the way I'd say it will be this: the way of Jesus is, if you slap me on the right cheek, I'm going to turn to you the other one also. And if necessary, I'm going to lay down my life for you. The cross is what Christ calls us to do for the sake of our enemies, and that nations can't adopt that ethic. They can't survive if they practice a Jesus ethic. You can't go to Vladimir Putin and say, I love you so much, no matter what you do to me, I'm going to lay down my life for you. You're going to be overrun. So nations have this military element to them where they self-defense. And the point of that then is that as Christians, we need to step back and go, our ethic is different from the nations. And we need to not just simply side with one side being good, one side being bad, or one side being the innocent victims or whatever, and say, let's practice a Jesus ethic and encourage the church to promote peace for the sake and well-being of everyone. So, Mae, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Robin. While I'm talking, if you could put a link to Determined Truth in the chat,
Sure.
and people have been asking for that would be great.
Okay.
And he has some really exceptional guests as a part of that conversation. Thank you. I love the question that we're talking about today in terms of prophetic and pastoral responses. And I feel like that tension is a tension that we need to live into in this moment. As Christians, particularly as Christians in the Western world. Many of you might have seen, and we can share this with you as well, the Palestinian church issued a critique of the Western church and said, where are you? Where are you? And why are you ignoring the cry of the Palestinian church?
Right.
Which is not new, right? Which was a critique of the Western church from the Palestinian church before October 7th. And I think it's a call, one, from our brothers and sisters in Christ in the Middle East to not be ignored. And 2, a call from our brothers and sisters in Christ in the Middle East of why is the Western church so afraid to be prophetic? And some of it, I think, is this idea, and we'll talk about this a lot more, of on this issue, almost more than anything else, on issues related to Israel and on issues related to the church's relationship with the Jewish community, there's this expectation that you have to get it right because of historic anti-Semitism, because the church has been so wrong and so historically anti-Semitic, that there's this litmus test of often saying things incorrectly and doing things that have devastating effects towards the Jewish community, that there's this tiptoeing around certain issues. And so there's a lack of willingness to want to violate relationships with the Jewish community, or of willing to be prophetic, because what happens if I rock the boat, or I say something that I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be, I'll never forget, I posted a blog on Oberammergau. I don't know if any of you know this place in Germany, Oberammergau, and it's where the Passion Play takes place. And it was one of the most impactful experiences in my life. I was a young teenager. I think I was 13 years old. This Passion Play takes place every 10 years. Do you know this story, Rob?
No.
This is a town that in the Middle Ages, during the bubonic plague, the town prayed that God would spare them. And half of Europe was wiped out because of the bubonic plague. And this entire village in Oberammergau prayed that God would spare them and not one person would die.
Wow.
And so since the Middle Ages, every 10 years, they tell the story of Christ in a passion play. And the whole village takes 10 years to prepare telling the story of Christ. They still do it every 10 years. And it is a profound witness of the gospel. Well, I did not know that the village apparently has this horrific history of anti-Semitism.
Oh.
And so I wrote this story thinking that I'm sharing the gospel of Jesus, this profound, experience in my own personal life. And I was lambasted and told like I was being anti-Semitic, and I was promoting the hatred of Jews. And I couldn't understand the criticism, and it was a history I was ignorant of. And so how do we as Christians respond when anti-Semitism and not only in rhetoric, but in deed, right? Like violence towards Jews is a part of our history. And how do we take responsibility for that, but also not let it impede our ability to speak truth in this moment and to respond and stop violence in this moment, which I think is such a critical question. And so as I've been praying and as I've been trying to lean into what it means to respond to the provocations and the horrors that October 7th provoked, I think it's really, really critical that we talk about what Hamas did and what happened on October 7th. And I've been doing daily updates online, and sometimes I just say October 7th, and sometimes I say when this began. And we don't really want to say when the war began, because in many ways it's not a war, and in many ways it's a decades-long occupation, and in many ways, like, there's so many things that we could say. And so sometimes I use shorthand, which really is like inadequate. But October 7th for the Jewish people, and I think this is really, really critical, Jewish people in Israel and around the world are taught your entire life that people are trying to kill you. We read this in the Hebrew scriptures, in the book of Esther. We know this from the Middle Ages. We know this from the time of the Inquisition. We know this from the pogroms in Russia. We know this from the Holocaust in the 20th century. And we hear this from like the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, where suicide bombs were a mechanism that was used in resistance, where civilians were killed in Israel by suicide bombs. And so October 7th and the killing of civilians in such a brutal, brutal way for Jewish people in Israel was the exclamation mark at the end of the sentence that people are trying to kill you. You are not safe. You are not safe in Israel, this place that was supposed to be like the greatest, safety and protection, of anywhere in the world. And if you're not safe in Israel, you're not safe anywhere. And so part of what this moment calls for from the church is entering into the pain of the Jewish people and the legitimate fear and desire for security of what October 7th validated, or the trauma that provoked for many Jews in Israel and around the world. I just had a meeting with an Israeli yesterday who was saying it's unfair of us to ask for Israelis to be able to have empathy for anyone else's pain at this moment. Now, what he said is it's totally fair to ask them to be moral. You can ask them to be moral, but don't ask them to be empathetic, because they're in the midst of their own pain. And so we can be pastoral. And I've been challenging people, if you have, a synagogue nearby, reach out to the rabbi, right? If you have Jewish people in your community, share grief and seek to enter into a relationship from a pastoral posture. And I don't think in any way that compromises a response to the other realities, which we also have to talk about. So here we are on day 33 since October 7th. More than 10,000 civilians in Gaza have been killed. More than 4,000 children have died in Gaza. This is absolutely a crime against humanity. Israel's response has been a military response, and they are using Hamas as an excuse, and they are decimating the civilian population in Gaza. And so what's it mean to be prophetic in this moment? It means to absolutely call for a ceasefire. It means to say no more death of civilians. It means stop having Palestinians pay for the consequences of Hamas's crimes. It means talking about the decades-long occupation and the blockade on Gaza that existed for 16 years before October 7th. It means contextualizing this moment for the Palestinian people who have been struggling for liberation, since what they call the Nakba, the great catastrophe of 1948. And so both of these realities are true of Jewish suffering and fear and lack of security, and the fact that Gaza right now is one of the most horrific places on the earth, and the United States is supporting it. The United States, you started out by saying the church is complicit because we as Americans are complicit. And so I think, us holding those two things in tension is what's really critical at this moment. So I'll just close and say, I think that there are three things that are critical, and we can, of course, continue to have conversation. What's it mean to be a peacemaker? I often quote World Vision. I had the privilege of working with them for several years. And the founder had a prayer where he would say, break our hearts for the things that breaks the heart of God. And Israelis and Jews around the world have been traumatized, and Palestinians around the world, but in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and especially in these moments in Gaza, have been traumatized, and God's heart is utterly broken. And so I think we need to pray that God would expand our hearts. And some of us will navigate towards empathy and towards understanding the humanity of some people more than others. And so to pray that God would break our hearts for all people and expand our hearts, that we would allow them to be broken and to increase our capacity to love all people. Two, that we would reject false binaries, that we would reject the idea that we have to choose one people group over another. And so this is being demanded of us in Israel. It's being demanded of us in the United States. There's a campaign by the Israeli Defense Forces that says, stand with Israel or stand with terrorism. And I reject that. I would say stand with the people of Israel and stand, with the people of Palestine. Stand with people, don't stand with states. And if you truly care about the Jewish people of Israel, you have to care about their Palestinian neighbors. You have to. If you truly care about security for Jews, you have to care about freedom and liberation for Palestinians, and vice versa. And so we have to reject false binaries. And then third, and we'll talk about this more, of course, but throughout the scriptures, we see passages that talk about justice and, love mercy and do justice. And so what does justice look like for the more than 200 people who have been taken hostage into Gaza, right? It doesn't only mean their release. What does it mean to have justice and to respond to the atrocities of Hamas? I think that's a very legitimate question. I don't think justice looks like bombing innocent Palestinian children in Gaza, right? And so we can talk about justice in that specific case. And what does justice look like, for Palestinians, who've been struggling for self-determination and for liberation? And so we could have like week-long course on this, Rob. I'm sorry, I know I probably talked more than my 10 minutes, but that's a bit of an introduction of what I think it means to engage in peacemaking. Yeah. Well, where do you want to go from here?
Well, there's some comments, I think, in the comments box, and there's a Q&A there. Do you want to address the Q&A first, or I'm sure some of the things that we have to say will come up then.
Sure. Yeah, I see the comment about remember that some of those people are Hamas fighters who are counting as civilians. I think it's really important to remember Gaza has 2.3 million people in it, and more than 50% of them are under the age of 18. And so Hamas is in Gaza, but this idea that of the 10,000 people who've been killed, that it's equivalent with Hamas is just not true. And the idea that because Hamas did this, it's Hamas's fault, that it's still okay to kill children, it's just a false it's a false equivalency. And there are laws by which war needs to be fought, international humanitarian laws. And the US has changed its rhetoric actually since the beginning of this, and is calling on Israel to act in accordance with international law. The world would say that Israel is not. The disproportionate effect on civilians, the destruction of infrastructure, the bombing of hospitals, and Israel's response would be that Hamas is putting weapons under churches, or Hamas is using humans as shields. And I'm sure that that's happening. I'm not denying that that's happening. I am denying that that's happening 10,000 times, right? And we know Christians in Bethlehem. I mean, one of my closest friends, her aunt was killed in the Orthodox Church, Porphyrius Church, and the church was right next to a house that was supposed to have had a Hamas fighter in it. And the calculation was made that the 18 Christians who were killed in this church, that their death was worth it to kill this Hamas fighter. And that's what's illegal. That is what is a violation of human rights. You can't say, I'm going to kill these 18 people to get this one person. That's the calculation that's considered.
Jonathan Kuttab, who's a Palestinian lawyer, discussed that with me on my live stream on Monday night. So you can see that on my website there. And he talked about the proportionality of that. And I don't deny that. I'm not an expert at all that Hamas is using people as human shields, but the reality is that, you see these videos of a child being rescued from the rubble and the exultation and the joy of that. But then you look and see the next scene of a person who couldn't find their child in the rubble. And I think that should break our hearts. And I think, the reality is Hamas is not fighting according to the rules of war either. And so as a prophetic voice, we need to call them to fight against the rules of warfare also. And I think we need to acknowledge the fact that, someone made a comment about the rise of anti-Semitism, and that is indeed the case. People are using this as an opportunity for anti-Semitic acts around the world. But there's also an increase in violence in the West Bank. And that's often being neglected as well. So you have a rise of settler violence in the West Bank, the bombing in Jerusalem and other parts also. So this is escalating, and I think the answer is that the church has got to stand back and be a prophetic voice to say this has to stop. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword, as Jesus said. This is not the way of the kingdom, nor the way shall we move forward.
Yeah. I see some other questions and comments, and I'm eager to talk about how we engage in prophetic action and really also oppose anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I think that's a great question. Yeah. And so let's talk about that, Rob. What are your thoughts?
It's for me, I mean, the tragedy of all this, I want to wrap this in an eschatological garb, and I don't want to go too deep in that. But the tragedy of all this is that when the church gets behind one side or another side, the false binary that you referenced to, Mae, what happens there, instead of being a prophetic voice for peace and for justice, for the humanity of all peoples and the human dignity of all peoples, and we are on one side or the other. And as a result of that, what is our witness now to the entire Muslim world, the entire, not just Arab world, the entire Muslim world, when we are seen as siding with one side and justifying the devastation of Gaza, for example? Oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, now that is looked upon as an attack against all Muslims by the Islamic world. Instead, we're simply saying, hey, listen, we're not denying that nations have the right to defend themselves. But what we're saying is, they need to broker peace, and that's what's in the best interest of everybody. And I think this is so damaging to our witness, and that's why I think we need to wrap this in an eschatological guard, because I think this is what the devil exactly wants the church to be doing, is to be playing on the wrong play yard.
Thank you. And I think we've been talking about this a lot in terms of one of the things that's been happening in the United States. I don't know if you heard, Saturday, there was one of the largest protests in Washington, D.C. It's being reported that it was more than 100,000 people. It was a pro-Palestinian protest on Saturday. And one of the things we've been talking about at Churches for Middle East Peace is that some of the language at these protests, both the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestinian protests, are so, the language is, some of the rhetoric is just horrific. And an expression that we've been having a conversation about is this phrase, from the land to the sea, Palestine will be free. And for Jewish people, many people think that phrase or expression has been used historically to mean the eradication of the state of Israel, that the surrounding Arab states have not acknowledged Israel's right to exist historically. Many, of course, since have, there's a peace agreement with Egypt, there's a peace agreement with Jordan, there since have been normalization agreements with other, Arab states on the Arab Peninsula. And so, now, of course, many Arab states do acknowledge Israel's right to exist, but for a Jewish person hearing this expression, that can sound very anti-Semitic, and yet it's one of the chants, right? I mean, it's this expression, and so you might have heard, I don't know if you know, just in the last 24 hours, Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian member of Congress, was just censured for her advocacy for Palestinian human rights. And that expression was one of the reasons people are saying she's anti-Semitic. And she's saying, hey, I only meant that as liberation and justice for Palestinians. I'm not calling for violence at all. And so rhetoric is so critical. And so for us to understand how different people might understand or interpret language, I think is really, really critical and important. And that also doesn't mean, there is a whole movement globally to define any criticism of the state of Israel or Israeli policies as anti-Semitic. And I think differentiating in that regard and saying, hey, criticizing Israeli policies is not inherently anti-Semitic. There's a difference. And so educating,
especially when you make a difference between a distinction between the Israeli government and those in power and the Israeli people. That's there. One of the, and by the way, if I can reiterate it, it's easier for us if you put your statements and your questions in the Q&A box than it is to follow the chat link there. One of the comments in the chat box in the Q&A box, May, was, will a ceasefire, how will Hamas be stopped? And you and I discussed that a little bit when you were on my live stream last week. I discussed a little bit with Jonathan on my Monday night, and I have a live stream with Greg Khalil tonight. We'll discuss that again. But part of the things that we discussed there was this is not going to eliminate Hamas. The idea of decimating Gaza and destroying Hamas is not going to eliminate Hamas. As Jonathan Katab said on Monday night, he says, Hamas becomes an ideology, it becomes an idea. And as soon as you eliminate these, what you do is you radicalize the ones who survive. You push everyone down to the Sinai Peninsula and you just radicalize the ones who survived, as well as the fact that Hamas has some of its lead operatives are outside of Gaza. And I think you have more insight on that as well. So again, this goes back to the saying that war doesn't actually solve the problems. It just creates more problems. So you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been saying Israel at this moment does have an existential crisis. I mean, I think, Israel has to make a decision about what it wants its future to look like. And historically, the mechanism by which Israel has employed security has been through military prowess. And so the way that Israel has made itself feel secure is by military deterrence. It's literally a mechanism of deterrence. And it is written and codified in Israeli military law that if Israel is attacked, it will respond disproportionately. So a rocket is fired into Israel, no one is harmed, then bombs are dropped on Gaza. I mean, we've seen this every few years.
Right.
And it's not just that we see it happening, it's codified. It is a mechanism of response, right? It's deterrence. And so Israel really has three large buckets, and there's 100 different options in each of these buckets, but they have the choice. Are they still going to pursue deterrence as a mechanism of security and safety, which is violence? And I think it's clear violence begets violence, right? Can you keep 2.3 million people in Gaza? Can you keep them in a prison? Can you keep them subdued by military control? And right. I would argue October 7th, the answer is no, you can't, regardless of, I mean, the people in Gaza have been living under a blockade by sea, by air. I mean, I've spent time in Gaza, and there are drones that fly overhead, and all you
Yep.
hear is like the whole time you're in Gaza, that's what you hear, and then there's a fence that's a militarized fence, which is part of why October 7th happened, is when Hamas attacked the fence, they completely shut down that whole mechanism, and the fence was breached 30 times. Or more than 30 times. So Israel has some choices. And so they have a choice. Do they want to keep militarizing and keep, this mechanism of security? Do they want to either displace or eradicate the people group? So they have a choice of ethnic cleansing or genocide. And many people are saying what's happening in Gaza right now is nothing less than ethnic cleansing. And some people are saying it's absolutely genocide. On the second day, October 8th, Israel made the choice to cut off water, food, and gas from all of the people in Gaza. And it was collective punishment as a means to try to put pressure on Hamas to have them return hostages, and to surrender. And that is, again, illegal by international law. Since then, it is said that water has been turned on to South Gaza. There is not electricity, so you can't pump water. Since then, the average amount of trucks per day as of 48 hours ago was only 30 trucks per day. And before the war began, you needed about 500 trucks a day, 5 days a week to prevent malnutrition before the war, before bombing, before water was turned off. So you have the choice of war, ethnic cleansing, or genocide, or you have the choice of peace.
Right.
And peace doesn't have to be absolute. Peace can be proximate. Peace can mean peacekeeping forces. Peace can mean incremental peace. I think someone put in the chat, what would happen if, if everyone from Gaza came, running into Israel, would Israelis just shoot them? I think one of the things that's important for people to understand is Israel is completely militarized. Settlers, Jewish communities built on Palestinian land, have AK-47s, or those, I'm not a ballistic.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I'm not either.
They have like major weapons. There's a New York Times article right now that Orthodox settlers are being weaponized by the Israeli government to provide security for settlements, even though they've never served in the military. Yeah. They're taking a 3-week course, and they're allowed to shoot with impunity. And I would say there is resistance. There's Palestinian resistance in the West Bank. So settlers, it's dangerous for settlers in different communities, right? But Palestinians are not allowed to have guns. Resistance fighters in Palestine have guns, but Israelis are allowed to have weapons. And so you walk through Israel, and not only do soldiers have weapons, but settlers throughout Israel, also have weapons. And so it's a very militarized society.
Yeah. I would add to that also, Mae. I've been on a couple webinars with people from Gaza, or they're no longer in Gazans, but they're Gazans, discussing, and the point they said was the magic bullet to end all of this, the magic bullet to end Hamas, is justice for the Palestinians. He says, you give us justice and we'll take care of Hamas. Hamas will go away. And I think that not only is a Jesus way of doing it, but it's ultimately a way of doing it. And then again, to iterate that, the settlers, there's a Al Jazeera report that just came out in the last maybe a week or so. I'll see if I can find the link here and put it in the chat box. In the West Bank, it's olive season, it's harvesting season, and some West Bank, Palestinians went to go farm their lands and get their olives off the trees, and the settlers, there's one little tent, RV or camper up there, or whatever it might be, on the hillside. They set up a camp, a settler did, and they put cement blockades in the road, and these farmers can't now farm their own land, and there's the Israeli military right there to protect those settlers. So even in the West Bank, they can't even farm their own land. You don't think much of it, but when you begin to realize that this becomes a daily reality of living in a conflict there, the only solution is ultimately peace and justice. So absolutely.
And I think I agree, and I'll start to work through.
I
think we've been touching these questions, but maybe not being as direct in responding to them. There was a question about with the ceasefire, how will Hamas be stopped? And I think you responded to that some in terms of
right.
Many people say if you give justice to the Palestinians, that would be an answer to Hamas. Do you have more thoughts on that?
No, I think that's really ultimately the key. And so Greg Khalil May, you know him well, is involved in negotiations with Israel and Palestinians. He's an American lawyer of Palestinian descent, and he'll be on my live stream tonight. And that'll be a large part of our conversation. So we'll let Greg expound upon that. From a technical perspective, he's still well connected also. So one of the questions was, do we see the parallel with the American treatment of the indigenous peoples? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. This is America doing what America does, and we have to own that sin also. I think that's another thing that we need to recognize. I don't know if you want to add to that comment there.
I will. One of the concepts that was used in US expansionism was a concept called terra nullius, the idea that land is empty land, terra nullius. And that concept was also used in the establishment of the State of Israel. So there was an expression that was used in early Zionism by Ben-Gurion, and maybe you heard it, a land without a people for a people without a land. And the thought was a land without a people, that even though there were 1 million indigenous Arabs, and there was a very small remnant of indigenous Jews as well that spoke Arabic, that lived in the land, but the majority of the population was Arab, that because they were not cultivating the land and using it to the greatest of its potential, in large part, that was justification for others to take control of the land. And so that actually was an Ottoman era rule, that if land was not cultivated, it could be taken by the state. And so it used to be under the Ottoman era that if land wasn't cultivated for 7 years, that it could be taken and made state land. And that is actually a rule in the West Bank now, that if land is not cultivated, but now it's 3 years. And so what happens is, if Palestinian farmers are cut off from their land for 3 years and they don't cultivate the land, it then can be confiscated and become state land. And this is one of the mechanisms by which Palestinians become dispossessed. And so you separate Palestinian farmers, either by the separation barrier or, some of these things that Rob was talking about. They're not able to then access their land, and then it becomes state land. And, all of a sudden, more land belongs to the State of Israel, and less land is available to become, the future state of Palestine, for example. Yeah.
One of the questions that comes up, and I don't think we want to go there, is, let me make sure is my sound on? Okay, all right, there you go. I'm looking at the Q&A box, and it's blocking my own thing there. It says, is there credence to the idea that October 7th was a setup for Israel to engage in this war? And that, the conspiracy theories like that, of course, I don't think we should go there. I think going down that path just leads to potential anti-Semitism and whatever. And again, you just have all these narratives on both sides, and we're reading it through our own narrative lenses, and that's a possibility. But I don't know if I'd go down that path. I did write a series of blogs on my website. So if you go to determinetruth.com in the blog tab and you scroll down, you can click on Israel Palestine, and all the ones that are marked with Israel Palestine will come up. I did a series of posts a year ago, June, I think, of 2022, where I said the status quo is not status quo. And what I meant by that was, at the time we have peace, and there's peace, and everything's fine and dandy, and everything's just kind of stable. In this case, it's not stable, because every single day that goes by, one more settlement is built, one more settler moves in, one more Palestinian loses land, one more, and eventually, given the status quo long enough, this will all become Israel. So there is this reality that Israel, whether they wanted to precipitate this war so they just go ahead and take it more rapidly or not, I'm not going to go down that path. But the reality was, they were doing this de facto over the course of the last number of years, and this is part of the problem there. So I guess I'd also add to this, and that is, one of the things that Hamas said, and I'll bring this up with Greg also, and I brought this up with Jonathan on my live stream on Monday, was that Hamas said at the very beginning, and you pointed this out to me, Mae, when we were together in Phoenix a few weeks ago, that Hamas said, hey, we'll stop ceasefire, we'll negotiate the release of our hostages for the release of prisoners. When I hear that as an American white American male, I think, oh, that doesn't seem fair. You took women and children as hostages, Hamas. You took these women and children as hostages, civilians, and you want Islamic radical terrorists to be released in a prisoner exchange. That doesn't seem like a fair swap. Obviously, Israel shouldn't do that. But as I investigated this, and as Jonathan Kutab shared with me on Monday night, and he says, no, that's not what's happening. Israel has a policy of detaining people for 6 months, 9 months, or even longer, without a charge, without a trial. I said, well, do you ever represent these people? He's like, well, there's nothing to represent. Jonathan's a lawyer. He's like, there's nothing to represent. They haven't been charged with anything. He's like, I can talk to them, but I can't help them because there's never been a charge. And it's these kind of detainees, illegal detainees, that Hamas is asking to be freed. And in a sense, you could say it's hostages for hostages. And, without being too polemical there, I think that's something that we have to consider.
Right. That's called administrative detention. And my understanding is people can be held under administrative detention without charges for 10 years, and then it can be recharged every 10 years. And so people can be held indefinitely without charges in that regard.
Yeah. And then adding to that, of course, would be the child detentions. And of course, you should see DCI / Palestine, Defense for Children International / Palestine, that an organization to defend children that have been detained by Israel because they threw a rock, or some kid in the village threw a rock, and they're imprisoned in the military prison in the West Bank. I asked the head of DCI Palestine a number of years ago. We were at a congressional dinner, and I said, what percentage of these children are tortured? And he says, well, that just depends on how you define torture. He says, by law, zip tying the children, they zip tie them, they put them in the back of a military tank and drive them to the military court at 3 a.m, and the court doesn't open until 8 a.m. They're left out in the cold. And he says, but he says, I define zip tying as torture because it's against the law. He says, but not including that, he says, I would estimate that as many as 90% of these children are tortured. And he says, and the way to know this, he says, is ask their parents, ask their moms, because when these kids are released, they wet their beds, they have nightmares every night. And so you have, and again, not to draw one side or the other in the narrative, there is this underlying injustice that's going on. And again, to say the magic bullet appears to be not just peace, but peace with justice. And that would help Hamas go away.
Thank you. And I want to get to, as much as we're able, the rest of these questions, and they're really, really good ones. So someone has asked, what's Iran's motivation in supporting this current conflict? My understanding, I am not an expert on Iran by any means, but my understanding is that much of Iran's hatred towards Israel began post the Shah regime in 1979, and that much of the motivation of Iran, it's anti-West, Western sentiment, that not only that, Israel's treatment of Palestine is a significant motivating factor. Of course, Iran supports Hezbollah, which is a militant group that is deemed a terrorist organization based in Lebanon. It's actually one of the most significant actors in the Lebanese political regime. And currently there are escalations on the northern border with Israel, and tens of thousands of people in northern Israel have evacuated because of the escalations between Hezbollah. And so one of the concerns has been whether or not the war with Hamas will escalate to a war with Hezbollah. Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, just gave a speech on Friday, and the concern was he was going to declare war on Israel. And he did everything all the way up to the edge of declaring war. And so what analysts are saying is they're waiting to see, that Hezbollah is waiting to see how Hamas does, and that if Hamas is defeated, that then things might escalate even further with Hezbollah. But that the primary motivation for Iran, there is anti-Semitism, anti-Western sentiment, and then also Israel's long-standing occupation and treatment of Palestinians, is my understanding in that regard.
Yeah, one of the questions that comes in is what makes a response. What makes any of us think that Hamas is going to be honorable in hostage exchanges when they could have gone the hostages only right out? I'll leave it at that. And the answer to that, I'm not addressing necessarily that point. I'm simply addressing the fact that there's this injustice going on both sides there, and the way forward needs to be a way of peace and a brokered peace that brings justice to all parties. that brings and again, Mae started off by acknowledging the trauma of Israelis and the trauma that they have experienced in their life, and how this October 7th just and inflamed that trauma. And we have to understand that trauma on both sides here. And I think whether Hamas honors it or not, I don't know. I'm not a legal expert here. Many others could do so, but I'm just pointing that out to say that there is this injustice on both sides of the aisle here. So, and John put in DCI-Palestine the web link to that in the chat box, I noticed.
And I'll speak to what makes us think Hamas is going to be honorable in the exchange process. I am not a defender of Hamas in any way. I think, October 7th, the atrocities were so horrific.
Yeah.
Like there's no excuse, there's no justification. I think their actions absolutely have to be condemned.
Right.
And not only condemned, I think justice should be done. I saw comments by Kaz in the chat about how we're presenting this, that Christianity is pacifist. I lead a peace building organization that is nonviolent, which is but it represents 33 denominations: Catholic, which it is a just war denomination; Orthodox, Protestant, evangelical. I'm a Dietrich Bonhoeffer scholar at which is affiliated now with Hebrew College in Boston, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself was a pacifist who became an interventionist. And so I'm someone who believes that sometimes intervention has to happen for the sake of the protection of human life. And so I would adhere to what's called, there's just war and pacifism, and in between is called just peacemaking, where many people would argue and assert that just war theory is not adequately applied, that the criteria for going to war is sometimes skipped over or not diligent enough. And so just peacemaking says sometimes war might be necessary. And I personally would assert that and would believe that that's true. I mean, I think when you look at the Holocaust and the Shoah, I don't know how 6 million people can be annihilated in such horrific circumstances and the world not intervene militarily. Right. And so that being the case, the criteria by which we engage in violence, I think, has to be applied in the most extreme way, in the most strict criteria, which I absolutely would assert is not happening in Gaza. When you bomb a house next to a church and 18 people, who are Christians, who are nonviolent, who are disengaged from the conflict are killed, 18, let alone 10,000, right? Which, by the way, I don't think I responded to those numbers. I have a list in Arabic of all of the names. Every single person who has died, their name has been written with their numbers, according to the health minister in Gaza, which, yes, it's Hamas. Those numbers have never been questioned in previous wars. And the New York Times came out and said Israel is not questioning those numbers. So the idea of the numbers being inflated, it's actually believed that the numbers are less than what they actually are, because thousands of people are still under the rubble. As
many as 20 or 30,000 they're estimating are under the rubble.
Or at least several thousand. I don't know if it's tens of thousands. But why do we think that Hamas is going to be honorable in exchange of the hostages? The answer would be Gilad Shalit. So Gilad Shalit was an Israeli soldier who was held captive by Hamas for more than 5 years. And he was held according to the Geneva Conventions, so according to international law, in every single way except one. He was held he was given food, water, health, all of the things that you're supposed to do according to international law. The only thing that Hamas did not allow him to do, which they were supposed to allow him to do, was they did not let him call his parents. And so Hamas has released videos, or at least they did initially, of a young French Israeli hostage. They showed that she was injured. They showed that she got treatment. They did a video of her. So there are indications that they are keeping the hostages, because in order for there to be a legitimate exchange, they have to keep them according to international law for the exchange to be justified. And so there are indications, according to past exchanges, that they would do so as they have done in the past.
Yeah. If I can comment on Kaz's notes too, and thank you very much, Kaz. I do not intend to present, I hope I did not, at least, that Christianity is a pacifist religion. In fact, that's my problem, is that not enough Christians are pacifists, that they're actually endorsing war, that they're promoting war, that they're promoting violence, that they're justifying, that they're arguing that this has to happen, especially when they put this in an eschatological context. Oh, this is necessary precursor to the second coming of Jesus. So I am very skeptical, maybe even more so than Mae, in terms of the idea of a just war. I won't deny that at some point in time, Hitler has to be stopped. I understand that, and I reckon I'm not naive at that point in time. But I do think that when we use the just war theory to justify war, which is very prevalent in the academic articles that I've been reading, and we're naive to realize that nations don't fight war unless they have some self-interest involved at all. Right, the United States knew well into, and by the way, our sympathies with you, Kaz, and that you said some family members were murdered by the Nazis there, and we express our sorrow and sympathy to you there. But the United States knew well into the war in 1940s that the Nazis were killing Jews, and they stayed out of it because they didn't want to get into a war. They didn't have enough self-interest. They were forced into the war. So the idea that, well, we're the good ones here. So I think nations fight wars for their own self-interest too often, and even when a war appears to be justified, it's not. And then I think the other thing here to just put an exclamation point on what Cass had to say: the church has actually been more complicit in anti-Semitism than Islam has. And so when we make this a Muslim-Jewish thing, we fail to recognize our own history and our own complicity there. So I think, and that goes back to the question about the indigenous peoples here in the United States also.
There's a question of, is there credence to the idea that October 7th was a setup for Israel to engage in war? I'm sure you are aware that the Israeli government and Netanyahu's coalition was at risk prior to October 7th. There were significant protests that had been going on for weeks because of the proposed judicial reform. Israelis and there were international protests were protesting democracy being under threat in Israel. The coalition that Netanyahu was leading was the most far-right government in Israel's history. Right. There has been reports that both Egypt and the United States warned the Israeli government that something was going to happen, that there was going to be an incident. So there has been rumors or suggestions that maybe Netanyahu and Israel let this happen because nothing unites a country the way that war unites a country. And, I don't have any inside knowledge about that. I think the idea that they let something to this degree happen to stay in power, I would assume that has no credence. I think if it was a minor incident, then you might say, well, okay, maybe they let that happen, but something to this degree where, for the security fence around Gaza to completely be shut off is unheard of. The tactical, the fact that this took a year of planning, and that the things that I've heard that it was done on actually like landline phones, which is part of how Israel didn't know it was happening. I think there's no credence to the idea that they let this happen in order for Netanyahu to stay in power. Now, I will say the long and protracted war, Netanyahu has no incentive for this war to be brought to an end. And so there are absolutely political dynamics for this war to continue because, he is under threat of indictment. His government right now, there is a war government. And so Israel has some significant problems to face, even apart from what is happening in Gaza. And so there is not incentive for the war to be short, because that would certainly not serve Netanyahu, and the Israeli government.
It also serves the United States government to not necessitate a brokered peace either, because of the political will of the American congressional leaders and president also. So that's something else to consider. So, yeah. There's a question here, Mae, about the heavily nuanced and complicated issue, acknowledging that for Israel and the Jews, which has a long history to it, well before 1948, are we pretending that this is not leading to an inevitable continuation of attacks on Israel and on the Jews around the world? No, we're not. I hope we're not. I don't think we are. And I think we're acknowledging, in fact, that this war has actually precipitated more violence against Jews and anti-Semitic attacks around the world. And that's something else that we need as the church again. The idea of this little meeting here today is a pastoral and prophetic response to say we must speak up against injustice everywhere. And that includes the anti-Semitism around the world.
And I think, something I didn't say that I often say is not only about reaching out to rabbis in our communities, but I think we have to commit to standing alongside our Jewish brothers and sisters and siblings, and to say, we stand for your protection, right? But protection can mean solidarity. It doesn't have to mean violence. And so I think that one of the things we've been talking to the White House about is the U.S. sending further militarization to the Middle East. First it was the USS Ford, I think, the aircraft carrier. And the U.S. has this idea that if we send further military to the Middle East, that it's deterrence, to other Arab states. And our argument is that this actually feels a little like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like we're further militarizing with the idea of de-escalating, and that doesn't feel like de-escalation. And so what's it mean to, stand in solidarity to protect Jews, to say, absolutely, we stand against anti-Semitism in rhetoric, but also in action.
Yeah. One of the questions here, Mae, I have my thoughts, but I'd like to hear yours, and we'll see if we're on the same page or not. That'd be interesting. Is the BDS movement a viable nonviolent option for pressuring Israel to change?
So BDS is what shifted boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is what shifted the game in terms of South Africa. And it has been a movement in response to Israel that is much, much more controversial, in large part because boycotts were the first step against Jews in leading into World War II. And so boycotts for Jews around the world are much more loaded for Jewish people. There is a moderated engagement in boycott, divestment, and sanctions, where some groups will choose to boycott only settlement products. It used to be in Europe, and I know that this was being questioned. I don't know if they're still doing it, but Europe used to require the labeling of settlement products to make it easy for people in Europe to boycott products that are made in Israeli settlements. Churches for Middle East Peace, our 33 denominations, have diverse perspectives on the engagement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but all of our groups advocate for the right for people to be able to engage in economic measures. And I think what's really important for people to know is that in the United States, there are laws that are seeking to make it illegal for Americans to be able to engage in boycott, which is fundamentally a violation of First Amendment rights. So in states and federally, there are laws that have been proposed that would make it illegal to boycott Israel. And so we do a lot of work advocating for the right for people to engage in taking economic measures. And I think that it's a very viable nonviolent mechanism. I'd point people to, there's a great movie called The Wanted 13 about Palestinians.
I think it's the Wanted 18.
Wanted 18. Did I use the wrong number? I'm sorry.
You said 13. Yeah.
The Wanted 18 about Palestinians boycotting milk.
It's great. It's great. It's you have to pay for it. It's not a free movie on Netflix though, but it is great. Yeah. My concern, of course, is with the inherent anti-Semitism, at least the assumed anti-Semitism that arises from it. But I do think that as Americans, we should stop and say, hey, states that have outlawed this, you're infringing on our First Amendment rights of free speech. So
Are there any Israeli and Palestinian leaders that can be bridges? You know, one of the challenges right now in Israel, there was an Israeli journalist who was saying Shiva over Palestinians who had died in Gaza, and a group of people, like a mob of sorts, like gathered at his apartment building because they were so upset that he was even praying over Palestinian dead. It is considered incitement right now to in Israel to stand on behalf of Palestinians. To say I care for Israelis and Palestinians right now is completely unacceptable. People I know in Israel who completely would advocate for a ceasefire are saying it is not worth saying so, because if you say so, you would be taking your life literally into your own hands. And so there is not a culture right now or space in civil society. Right now in Israel, you have people that have been a part of the peace movement for decades who are literally going to join the army in this moment. And so part of what we need to do is to encourage and strengthen, like there are so many or at least a small group of courageous, both Israelis and Palestinians who are saying, we're going to stand on behalf of the other. And so I'm in touch with some Israelis who are accompanying Palestinians in the South Hebron Hills to protect them from settler attacks. And these Israelis are literally like putting themselves in harm's way to put themselves in between settlers and in between soldiers and Palestinians, because things in the West Bank right now are, so volatile in that regard. But things have just really, really escalated in that regard. And there's very, very little room for that dynamic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Most Israelis are not in support of Israel's governmental approach to Palestinians. You know, I'll quote Danny Seideman. He's an Israeli human rights lawyer, and he always says, Israelis in Tel Aviv are sipping cappuccino while sitting on the edge of a volcano. And I would say October 7th was the volcano erupting. I think most Israelis, many, many settlers who live in West Bank settlements live there because it's cheap. Many of them are militant settlers, but a lot of them are just economic settlers. So not unlike injustice in our country, like racial injustice, many white Americans are ignorant of racial injustice in the U.S. because we're not exposed to it, or we don't live in cities with, significant numbers of people of color, and I think in Israel, there's a significant ignorance of most people don't cross into the West Bank. There's big signs in red that say enter by risk of your own life. They say it's illegal in Hebrew and in English and in Arabic. And I actually think there is very, very little resistance in Israel to the government's approach to Palestinians. The movement of human rights activists in Israel is very, very small. And unfortunately, it's smaller at this moment.
Right. Yeah.
You want to go maybe for 5 or 10 more minutes, Rob?
Sure. You're in control here, so I'm just following your lead. Thank you for having me.
Let's see. What's the PA's position on the war with Hamas? This is not a war against Palestinians, though it may be used to make progress on Israeli goals. It is a war to uproot infrastructure of Hamas and to deter future terrorist attacks. You want me to go?
Yeah, that's fine. I think you're certainly.
So just this weekend, Secretary of State Blinken did shuttle diplomacy through the Middle East, and he met with President Mahmoud Abbas, also called Abu Mazen. And it was reported, although the PA is denying it, it was reported that there was an assassination attempt against Abbas this weekend. And it was reported that one of his security guards was killed. You can watch like videos and things online. What's interesting is this was not picked up in the Western media. The PA, by most Palestinians, is considered a proxy government to Israel. The Palestinian Authority has been willing to make peace with Israel. Their official position is a two-state solution. And so they're I'm going to just be crass. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They don't want to oppose what Hamas did because they will lose further credibility with the people, because even if the Palestinian people hate what Hamas did towards civilians, there is a part of Palestinian people that feel like it was an act of resistance, and that violence as an act of resistance is justified. Just the way Israel would say we have a right to defend ourselves, Palestinians would have the viewpoint we have a right to defend ourselves as well. And according to international law, an occupied people legally have the right to defend themselves against the military force. And Palestinians, I've just learned recently, because Israelis have mandatory conscription where men and women in Israel serve in the Israeli military, many Palestinians believe that any Israeli is not a civilian because they are required to serve in the military, even though the actual numbers of Israelis who serve in the military is only about 60%. It's not, 100% by any means, which is no justification. I'm just trying to explain Abbas. My understanding is that he did not condemn the Hamas attacks, but he was very heavily criticized by his people for even having met with Blinken, because Blinken and the US are viewed as so pro-Israel. And so they're kind of stuck in the middle in terms of their position. They, of course, are condemning the attacks on Gaza and the death toll on civilians in Gaza. Online resources. Did you want to share some of those, Rob?
NEMI.network, of course, has a whole resource tab that I would encourage you to take advantage of, NEME.network. And I think Nicole put that link in the chat box earlier there. So there's a lot of resources there for you to go with. Obviously, determinedtruth.com, the homepage. What we try to do with these live streams over the last 2 weeks, and we have a few more to do, is to simply say, look, it's time for the church to get engaged. It's time for the church to no longer sit back and go, who's right, who's wrong, but to advocate for peace. And the time is now. But we know that you don't have time to read books and to read 4 books to get a diversity of opinion. So let's bring on a breadth of interviews of individuals on kind of both sides of the aisle, knowing, of course, that there's not really 2 sides to the aisle. And so that's the idea behind those. So you can get kind of a digest in 1 hour interviews. And the links for them are all still live, whether they are live events or recorded events. And I'd encourage you to come on tonight again with Greg, because that's going to be your chance to really go, okay, what do we do with peace? And this is possible, and things of that nature there. So I think those are some places to start. And Mae, I'm sure you have a wealth of resources also.
Sure. So again, you see cmep.org there. We've been saying stand in the gap, give, act, pray. So we're inviting people to give to organizations like Determined Truth, like Rob's ministry, give to groups like Churches for Middle East Peace. We're doing advocacy. We're calling for a ceasefire, an end to all violence against civilians, a return of the hostages. We're calling for immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We will have more and more action opportunities. So right now we have an action alert to contact your elected officials to call for a ceasefire. We're actually going to be inviting people during Advent to call your elected officials every day of Advent. And so we're seeing that as a spiritual discipline, that every day more and more people are dying. And so we would really invite you to consider joining us for that. We have weekly prayer on Wednesdays. We have Thursday briefings. I do a 10-minute briefing. I try to keep it at 10 minutes or less. There's been a lot happening, but I do a 10-minute online briefing on our social media every day. But on Thursday, we do a live briefing where you can ask questions. So Churches for Middle East Peace, Evangelicals for Justice is a co-sponsor of this as well. I'll share the website for E4J in the chat. And so I'd encourage you to use those as resources. We have a Q&A that we created in terms of the war. If you're interested in that, you could send us an email at info@cmep.org, and we are happy to give you, we have info sheets We're doing a lot of analysis. We're paying close attention to what's happening. We're really grateful. Thank you so much for your time. This will be available on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch this or share it. If you do see things on social media, do share them. That helps spread the word.
Yeah.
It helps encourage people to ask questions. You know, we say pray for peace and work for justice, and we want to be advocates for, you know, holistic peace building, and we want to grow and learn together, and we want to advocate for a ceasefire and an end to violence, and the recognition of the humanity of all people.
Amen.
So, you know, may God go before us to that end.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks, Rob. Good to be with
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you, everyone.